Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today, I'm going to share with you one layout idea, but I'm going to do 3 different designs here. So here's the layout. It's very simple. I'm going to be using a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card base with a slightly smaller panel on top, stencil coming in from the bottom left-hand corner, and then a sentiment in the upper right-hand corner. Super simple, but with super simple sketches, you can do so many different designs. The first one, I'm going to be using the plum area stencil from the Crafter's Workshop. But the first thing I want to do on my panel that is 4 inches by 5 1/4 was put a little bit of blue in the background. Now, I used a dye ink for that. That is because on top of that, I am going to layer some pigment ink. Now what I used to put down that blue ink in the background was just my Amazon makeup blending brushes. That is going to give me a really nice soft look on that background, and then I can go ahead and start stenciling over the top. Like I said, I will be using pigment inks to do my stenciling over the top. That is because if you put a dye ink on top of a dye ink, you can sometimes get a little bit of blending between the two of them. So what I like to do is if I'm layering and I don't want them to blend at all, I like to put a dye ink down first, which that would be my blue ink, and then on top of that, put on the pigment ink. The pigment ink is going to sit on top of the paper, and it takes a little bit longer to dry, so keep that in mind. However, it's not going to bleed into the paper and blend with that blue ink underneath it. These are also traditionally very opaque inks, so they're going to cover up anything underneath them. Now to do my stenciling on top of this blue ink, I am using the Plumeria stencil from the Crafter's Workshop. And for this, I'm going to be stenciling different colors on different parts of this flower. I'm starting off with a very dark green, and this is the Rainforest ink, and it's the VersaFine Clear line. Now again, I'm going in with my Amazon blending brushes here. This comes in a very large set with all these different sizes, so it's great to get into those really tiny crevices. Once I'm done with all the leaves, then I can go ahead and move on to the other areas of the stencil. But what I want to say before I move on is whenever you are starting off with your blending, I always like to start with the lightest area first and then move to the darkest. Now, even though this orange and red look a little bit lighter in the green, once everything is dry, it's going to be about the same darkness on both of them. So I wanted to keep the green out of the flowers as much as possible. Now with the red and the orange, I'm also going to try and keep them contained as much as possible. But in between these little flowers, there are little branches that the flowers are hanging onto. Those are almost impossible to stay away from with the red and the orange ink. So I'm going to save those for last, and I'm going to come in with a very dark color. That's going to help color all of this over blending that I get from these other colors. So that's why I like to start with the lightest first, then you can go back in with your darkest and cover up any mistakes that you may make or over blending anywhere you may have it. Now for these flowers, I'm using 2 different inks. I use the Summertime ink, which is a nice bright orange, and then I'm using this Tulip Red ink to kind of blend in with it. Again, using those Amazon blending brushes to really get into all those really small, tight spaces. Excuse my hair, sometimes I have to get a little bit closer as I blend these out. My eyes just aren't what they used to be anymore. When you first start blending too, I want to say that there are going to be areas that you miss. It's hard to see some of these areas and what color they need to be when you first start blending. However, as you get more of the stenciling done, you're going to see areas that you miss. So keep your inks out, keep your little blending sponges or tips or whatever you're using next to your inks. That way you can go back in and fill in as you need to. Now for these little branches, I'm using Fallen Leaves, which is a nice dark brown ink. And I also used a Fantastics tool. Now, creating little scenes like this, I have a whole video on it. I will leave it linked in the top right-hand corner so you can go check it out and see all the different tools and inks I use when I make my scenes with my stencils. Now once the blending is done, I can go ahead and remove that stencil, and I've got this great background. The only thing that was left to do from my little sketch was add the sentiment. So what I decided to do for this sentiment, instead of stamping one, I'm going to be using a die cut. I'm using the Lawn Fawn Hello die. And I die cut that from some black cardstock. What I like to do whenever I'm putting down one of these die cuts, I just take it and stick it in my tweezers, flip that over, and apply some glue onto the back while my tweezers are holding onto it. This is going to save your fingers from getting gluey. It's also going to be a good little tool to put down your die cut whenever you go to put it onto your card base so your fingers don't smear around any glue. Now to get this nice and straight, I'll use my T-square ruler, line it up, and then just place down one side of my hello die. Then I can go ahead and remove those tweezers and line up my other side with the T-square ruler as well, and then give everything a good press. And now I know it's nice and straight on my card. I have a horrible time lining up my sentiments, so that's just a little trick that helps me get them nice and straight. All that was left to do was add that panel onto an A2 top folding card base, and there's the first card. Super simple, nice and flat, and this one's going to go through the mail really easily. Now, my next card, I am using one of my favorite stencils from the new release. This is the Tropical Fronds stencil. I have done a card similar to this where I used a foiling printable that I have for free on my blog. I will leave that video linked in the top right hand corner. And then down in the description box, I will leave a link to the video I did that is all of the different Crafters Workshop new release stencils. I go through them all. Their releases are super big, so sometimes it can just help to see the stencils kind of in real life instead of just on pictures on the internet. So for this, I'm using the Tropical Frond stencil, again starting off with a 4" by 5¼ white cardstock panel. And I like to get the placement of my stencil just right. Then I can go ahead and stick down my tape to the back. This is going to save me any tape marks on the front, but it's also going to keep my paper and my stencil attached together. So as I go in and I ink blend, nothing is going to move. If it does move, both are going to stay together, so I don't have to do any realignment or anything like that. Now again, going in with 2 layers here. This first layer is going to be a dyeing layer. I'm using my Catherine Pooler inks and my Amazon blending brushes for this layer. I'm starting off with Lime Ricky, and I'm going to put a really good layer of this through that stencil. I want this nice and bright. To add a little depth, I decided to come in with a little bit of eucalyptus ink as well. This is a little bit darker green, and I'm not being too careful with how I put this on. This is all going to end up sinking and soaking into the paper and blending together. Plus, you have it broken up with the stencil, and it's not going to look as solid once you take that stencil off. So don't worry about getting a perfect blend whenever you do a technique like that. Now once I have that off, I'm going to clean off the stencil really well, and then I'm going to flip it over. So the fronds that were on the right side are now going to be on the left, and the ones that were on the left will be on the right now. This is a good way to get a good mix and also make it look like you're not using the same stencil over and over and over and over again on your project. Now for this second layer, I'm going in with the Rainforest ink again. This is a gorgeous dark green ink, and I'm using a sponge dauber. This is a big one, so I get a lot of surface area. And I'm just going to pounce this through the stencil. I want a nice, really dark, even layer. No blending here, just pouncing it through the stencil, making it as dark and opaque as I can. I've also masked off the top of that card just so I don't have any accidental kind of smushing up above. But once I peel that off, I've got these gorgeous 2 layers of fronds on my card that are all ready to go. I love the look of this one layered up like this. It creates a really fun and bright card, and the only thing left to do was stamp my sentiment. Now on the first one, like I said, I used a die sentiment, but on this I'm going to stamp a sentiment. So whenever you look at sketches or designs you see online, think of how you can change it up to work for you. So maybe you don't have a just a note sentiment stamp like I'm using here, but you like the sentiment and you want to keep with that theme. Use a die if you have it. Use a hello die. It can really change up the look of a card just by switching up these little bitty elements on your card. For this, I'm using the Just a Note sentiment. This is from one of my favorite sentiment sets. It's called Sentiment Sampler, and it's from Paper Smooches. I've used it a ton, and it is black and all that sorts of stuff. You can tell I've really used it a lot, but I still love it. Now for this, all I did was mount that panel onto an A2 top folding card. And again, this is a nice flat card to send through the mail, but it has all those different layers on it, so it doesn't look super plain, which I love. Now, the third card, I'm going to use the exact same design, but I'm just going to layer different elements on top of one another for this final one. The other two, I've done 2 layers, and I'm going to start off with my 2 layers exactly the same. I'm starting off with the wave stencil from the Crafter's Workshop, and I'm stenciling through some blue dyeing. This is something borrowed from Catherine Pooler, again using my blending brushes for this. This is what I love to use when I want to get a nice blend. For this, I wanted to start darker towards the bottom and go lighter towards the top. If, for instance, I am just sponging ink through and I want it as dark as possible, that's when I go in with like a makeup sponge, works really well and they're nice and cheap, or you can use a sponge dauber as well. There are going to be times whenever you are stenciling that your stencil does shift on you. It just happens. It doesn't happen very often whenever I use this method, but this time I really got it with my hand good and kind of bunched it up in the center. So I needed to realign my stencil. Take your time, realign it, keep the tape on the back of your paper, and just hold up the sides a little bit. Line it up in the center, and then when you have that center lined up perfectly, press down on both sides and re-stick it to that tape. It's going to stick down, it's going to line up perfectly, and you'll be good to go. Now, once I have the wave stenciled, I'm going to go ahead and move on with this new seahorse stencil from the Crafter's Workshop. Now, not only does this have a little seahorse on it, but it also has some kelp, seaweed, I don't know. It's some kind of corally looking thing down at the bottom. And I am going to be using both of those on both the left and right sides. Now, whenever I choose to just use a little portion of a stencil and it's super close to another element on that stencil, I like to tape it off with painter's tape. In this case, I'm using my new favorite kind of found tool here, and that is this delicate surface painter's tape. It has really changed up the way that I use not only stencils but dies and tape them down. And it's really good on not tearing your paper. So if you haven't tried this, I would suggest trying it out. I'll leave it linked down in the description box below. Now, once I have that first little guy stenciled out, I'm going to go ahead and remove that tape. You can reuse it if you want to, but I'm going to go ahead and just mask off this next little guy on the right-hand side. You can see I'm reusing that tape over and over again. It resticks just fine, and it's going to give me longer life and use out of that roll of tape, and it's going to kind of cut down on the waste that I'm creating in my craft room, which is something I'm trying to be more conscious of. I'll go ahead and stencil that one down, and then while I have the tape in place, I'm just going to move this and do a little bit more sponging with that section down in the bottom left-hand corner. Now again, I want these as dark as possible, so I switched over to my little sponge tool, and then I'll just pounce on the ink, kind of rotating it and moving around, making sure I get it in all the little nooks and crannies of this very fine detail. Once I have all of those green pieces stenciled, it's time to stencil my seahorse. Now I've already used dye ink, I've already used pigment ink, so now I need something even more opaque to go on top of that to cover up all those layers underneath. So I'm going to use modeling paste. There are a ton of different kinds of modeling paste. I have a video dedicated to modeling paste that kind of shows everything that the Crafters Workshop offers. I will leave that linked in the top right hand corner as well. I am using this white pearl modeling paste, and I'm just going to give it some color. To do that, I added some of my powder watercolors. You can use so many different things to color this. You can use smush an ink pad, a dyeing pad onto your palette and mix it in with that. You can use reinkers, you can use your powder watercolors. There's a lot of different ways to color up your modeling paste. This is just the color I wanted, and I knew it was nice and vibrant whenever I added it to modeling paste. And the reason I added it to the white pearl was because I'm going to retain that pearl shine to it. and it's going to be a really gorgeous color. So once I had that on there, I mixed it up really, really well on my palette, and then I'll just go ahead and start putting it through the stencil. Again, I have marked off those two sides to kind of contain my mess. If I weren't marking off those sides with the painter's tape or masking them off, I would not be able to stay within this little guy. It just wouldn't happen, and I'd end up with a nice huge mess. So mask off those areas, make it easier on yourself, and then go ahead and put through your modeling paste. I'm using a palette knife to do this. And I'm putting a pretty generous and thick layer on here, kind of smoothing it out a little bit, but not really worrying about it too much because this is a pretty fine detail stencil. You aren't going to see a lot of these stroke marks here. So once I'm happy, I can go ahead and remove that stencil. I'm going to go ahead and wash off my palette knife, my little area I mixed everything up in, and my stencil quickly. Then I can go ahead and finish my card. I did let my little seahorse dry, and then just off to the right hand side, I stamped that "Hey There" sentiment. Again, that is from the Paper Smooches sentiment sampler set. That finished off the card. Super simple. All I did was mount that onto an A2 top folding card base, just like I did with the rest of the cards that I made today. Altogether, when you look at these cards side by side, you can tell that it is the exact same design, just using different elements, different sentiments, different stencils, different techniques to put through those stencils. But all in all, it's the same exact design. I just switched up the elements. So whenever you look at your cards and you think, oh, I like what I did there, just switch up your elements and make it again if you run out of ideas. I hope this inspires you to give this a try as well. I do it on so many of my projects. If you go back and look, you'll notice now. That is going to do it for me today. Don't forget all the information down in the description box below. Thanks for watching and happy crafting, everyone.